According to a study by Leaf et al. 2024, only 17.6% of studies in the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis from 2010 to 2020 included a measure of social validity. That means in more than 80% of cases, no one even checked if the treatment was meaningful to the person receiving it. Let that sink in for a minute. Are we truly focused on the experiences of our clients, or are we catering to the expectations of parents, teachers, and funding sources? When social validity is ignored, we risk turning ABA into compliance training, prioritizing what's convenient for others over what actually benefits the individual. Today, we're digging into the ethics of social validity. Who decides what goals matter? How can we integrate assent into practice? And more importantly, what happens when we get it wrong? Let's challenge outdated norms and reimagine what truly ethical, client-centered care looks like. Welcome to our podcast, the Action Insights, the intersection of ABA and mental health. I am Amelia Dalphonse, and this is my co-host.
I'm Nikki Dionne.
And today's episode is worth half a CEU. We're going to include 3 code words throughout the episode, so you want to be listening for that. There will be a link in the description below either below the video or in the show notes in the description, where you can click the link to purchase the CEUs. You're going to need to enter the code words into the quiz that will pop up after you purchase them, and you'll get your CEU certificate by email. To get you started, the first code word is prioritize. So make sure to either write that down, or if you're in the car, don't write it down. You could use your voice to text and make a note of it. The first code word is prioritize.
Maybe I'm so excited to have this conversation today, right? So we're talking a lot about whose social validity matters. Because as you said, when we are providing services as ABA providers or BCBAs, we have so many people who are at the table. And I was thinking pictures. So tables center a lot in some of the things that I talk about. But, we're really talking about today the extent to how our goals, procedures, outcomes of an intervention, how are they considered important, meaningful? Are they acceptable by the individuals receiving the treatment, their caregivers, society as a whole, which is really a big ask as I'm talking about it for BCBAs to kind of figure out, right? We're one person, maybe with one RBT working with a client, and we have a whole bunch of people who are coming in. And how are we starting to determine social validity and whose social validity matters?
A really good point. And we're often working with children or with adults who have a caretaker or who don't have legal rights to determine their own goals and things. So then it becomes kind of this question about, well, whose social validity matters. Like, if the parents are the primary stakeholders and they say they want to focus on a goal, but the child or the adult who doesn't have legal rights, how much power should they have in choosing their goals? And Nikki and I have some strong opinions about this. But I also wanted to kind of pull together some of the ethics codes around this, as I was looking at it and kind of thinking about this topic. The ethics code for behavior analysts actually covers a lot of this, and I think it's important to kind of try to take some of that, but also look at how we can work collaboratively with all of the different stakeholders to come to a more unified approach to treatment goals. So that way it's not one against the other and we're all satisfied with the treatment goals that we're working on, So when I was looking at it, there's several different ethics codes that align with this topic. You have 2.09 involving clients and stakeholders. Behavior analysts make appropriate efforts to involve clients and relevant stakeholders throughout the service relationship, including selecting goals, selecting and designing assessments and behavior change interventions, and conducting continual progress monitoring. So it says clients and stakeholders. So that's everybody who's involved. You're actually, like Nikki said, this is a lot of people.
And when we start to think about how we are assessing, right? Like I kind of think about the history of all the things I've done in my professional life, right? And we've talked about this in other episodes where the person and the provider I am now sometimes looks back and is like, gasp, how could I have done X, Y, and Z? Or, oh my gosh, I have so much more information now, right? So I have definitely sat with families and looked at caregivers and said, what are we working on when I have a child or an adult client sitting right there with them? And how am I starting to integrate like what efforts am I making to involve clients in the conversation? And that might look different, right? If I have a 3-year-old or a 14-year-old or a 27-year-old as my client, and the client, some clients, can tell us what they want to work on. Some clients can't vocally express. And then how am I assessing in my, interventions and meetings and everything? How am I assessing what the client may be telling me if they can't, with words communicate directly and effectively? And it gets hard to start to think about
It
those
does.
things.
And I mean, I think back, and there are times when I was first certified, or even before I was certified, and I was working at the community mental health center and providing direct services to autistic kids and their families, when I would come in more as the expert and be like, oh, well, here's the stuff we have to work on. And I do remember, and I think I told the story in an earlier episode, but it's one that just sticks with me. But I showed up at this family's house, and the we had some real challenges in the community. And when I brought her daughter back, I said, so we need to work on compliance. And that did not go over well with the mom at all. And I mean, that was my mistake. I certainly shouldn't have approached it that way. But I think a lot of, especially the new behavior analysts coming out into the field, don't necessarily have the skills that they need to bridge that gap between what they learned in school and what the families and caregivers want or expect, and what the clients want or expect. And then how do you juggle that with what the insurance companies want and expect, or the schools, because the schools want and expect something else.
It definitely becomes, very, very complex. And we probably could sit here and tell stories all day because you and I are good story people. And, I think it just leans to what, you were talking about is as I was a new provider, whether it was a mental health clinician or as a BCBA, we kind of come in and we're like, okay, I have all this information and like this is what we're going to work on, or we might be getting supervision, and that's the style of the people we're working with or the agency we're within, right? That we walk in and we're an expert. And I can't remember if I told the story, but it's kind of similar to yours when I was first a mental health clinician and I was so excited. We come out of school and we're going to like help all the people and do all the things, and similar, walked into someone's house and I'm like, I'm here to help fix all the things, right? And the parent was like, excuse you? And, I left feeling very humbled. And, it definitely really set a foundation for me of how I walk in. So I come in with interventions. I have a lot of information about the science, right? I have a lot of information about mental health and trauma and ABA interventions. I come with a whole bunch of stuff. I am not even close to having any information or being an expert on the client that I'm working with or on the family that I'm interacting with. And so, if we're looking at the efforts that we're engaging in, a really good first step is to think about partnership. Like, how am I coming into a situation with a partnership? Really kind of taking a step back and having these open conversations, because I will say now in my, can I say quote unquote, wiser years, I don't know. Um, I can come to a family and if they're, we must do compliance, but I come in this very humble, like, your child, here's the information I have. I can have a much more open conversation about what does that mean, right? Like, I'm not comfortable coming in and just working hard on compliance, but there are a bunch of other things we could work on to get to like a picture that the family is asking for. And it allows a lot with assent and assessment with the client themselves too, right? Instead of just saying like, you will sit at the table. We're looking at kind of all these pieces that come into it. And it really looks at how we're gaining consent, right? Which is another ethical code that is important. So 2.11 is obtaining informed consent, so it's, which I always feel weird about the word consent. It's such a legal term, right? So like a consent versus assent, but like really be explaining what we're doing and getting buy-in from everybody that we're working with is important. So there's the documentation part of it, which is the ethics piece, but also kind of thinking about how we're assessing agreement to services.
Yeah, and what happens when parents want you to target something that you're not comfortable targeting, like you said, with something like compliance, or I often would get families who wanted to target stereotypies, and that's a topic for our previous uh, um, episode, but I often had parents who asked me to reduce stereotypies for a variety of different reasons, but when what they're asking for doesn't align with what your values are, that's another opportunity to provide some sort of collaborative support as well. And really getting at what is the underlying reason behind the family wanting to target that. And something like compliance, when they want to target compliance, what they're really looking for is peace in their household. That's what they want. So if you can get at what they actually want, rather than I just want them to be compliant, it's really, I just want peace in my household. I want, when I say it's time for bed, I want them to be able to just go to bed, and because they're tired and it's the end of the day. So a lot of times you can get to what the underlying desire is of the family just by asking some more questions and being curious.
I love that word curious. I use it all the time. Like if we approach situations with curiosity and we're more likely to kind of get to that end piece that you're talking about. So you were talking and I was thinking about a situation where I was working with a family and it was about compliance and reducing stereotypies, right? And with curiosity and some time and relationship building, I was able with the caregiver to kind of get to the point that they suffered because their child was suffering. And like really think about that word suffering. And what they were being told was in order by others, right? Other kind of supports or wherever, is that to ease their child's suffering, they need to fit in, right? Which means that they have to look kind of, the parent took it that they have to look like their classmates. And that felt uncomfortable to the parent. But if I had just gone with like, sure, compliance, no stereotypies, which again, I am kind of opposed to just focusing on that alone, I wouldn't have been able to get to the underlying cause or the underlying concern from the caregiver, which was to stop their child from experiencing discomfort or aversion or suffering. And really think about that suffering. Well, I don't want to contribute to suffering by doing hard compliance, right? Because this was a child who did not respond to kind of those really, really structured and strict kind of expectations. What I wanted to do was create an environment and a situation where the child felt comfortable and could assent to the interventions I was providing. I was still working toward the goal of the parent and caregiver. And the outside benefit was that the child would, kind of manage more effectively in school, but not by fitting in, right? By being able to communicate or working on functional communication or working on ways to help like, the aversive kind of experiences they were having and understanding it from there. And so I could still kind of pin on every single person I'm involved with in regard to social validity. But if I just gone off that front kind of piece, I would have missed a lot, and the important part of social validity, right, is that it helps our clients engage better. It goes, we're working on autonomy. There's better long-term success. And I almost wonder sometimes in history, if I've missed that curiosity piece, could that account for poor engagement? Could that account for challenges with, like engaging in or practicing interventions or parent engagement or caregiver engagement or whatever it might look like? Always wonder, like, did I miss some of this in the social validity context in the past, and could that explain some of the challenges I experienced with some of the families that I may have worked with?
And are we even asking?
Right.
So it's easy for us to get wrapped up into the day to day. We're so busy collecting analyzing data and providing feedback to parents and staff. But are we even asking as we're going along if parents are satisfied with the services that they're receiving? And I didn't think about this in connection with this episode, but I actually created a parent survey, which I will link in the description that people can access because it's a really interesting way for people to be able to ask parents and analyze whether or not your families are actually satisfied with the services that they're receiving.
And I don't know if we have it in here. I'll see if I can find it. But I read so much stuff that sometimes I should just like, I wish I could keep it in like a Rolodex. I used that term the other day with a client. They're like, "What's a Rolodex?" And I was like, "Oh, it's from the 1900s." Um, but to remember all of the things. But
Yeah.
even what you said at the beginning, right? Like only 17.6% in, the study like considered social validity. And in the mental health world, the psychology world, like they do studies on kind of satisfaction, and um therapists tend to overrate their effectiveness, right?
Yep.
And it's the same thing. We're not assessing, kind of what the caregivers or the clients themselves are feeling about services. So it's really, I think it is important to kind of think about gathering that information.
I agree. And looking at it ongoing because at the beginning they may feel satisfied with services, but as services are going on, there might be some drift that's happening that we're not even all that attuned to, but parents might be more aware of it and they might be uncomfortable with the way services are being delivered over time, or the opposite could happen. Maybe the parents are a little uncertain at first, but as the BCBA or even the RBTs are working with their family and clients, they're starting to see how it all fits together and does align with what their goals are. And so satisfaction over time may actually increase. But if we're not asking the question, how would we even know? And it's not, at least in my history, has not been a regular part of services. We often, the companies that I've worked with in the past often will send out annual satisfaction surveys. But how are you tracking progress over time if you're only asking once a year? That's a challenge.
Yeah. Yeah, and I find that sometimes those larger metrics are more like like agency wide, depending if you work for like the size of your agency. They're aggregating all of those together for like an overall score. But what happens, we know what happens when you have a large pool. Like you have some high and low kind of ratings, and we take the average. And I'm always curious to know like what's happening for those people who are super satisfied, what's happening for those who are identifying that they're not, and how are we really shifting services for it, which we could probably go into for 800 years, knowing you and I. And on an individual basis, it gives us information. Like, even as supervisors, we're supposed to be having our supervisees assess our effectiveness, right? We gather data for so many things. And it's interesting that this is a piece, even though that this is in, Wolf's article, right? This is like one of the somebody mentions of like ABA, that it's something that I think gets pushed a little bit to the
Yeah,
side.
fully. And I think that we're just making assumptions that the things that we're working on are socially valid because we see them as important goals.
Yeah.
But then in like a cultural humility kind of context too, we have to look at each family really exists as its own culture, their own unique value system. So how are we making those adaptations to each individual family so that way we are truly customizing and meeting those needs of the individual families?
It like really does beg the question, like, who's typically dictating social validity, right? Who is really choosing that? And sometimes, and again, I think if anyone sticks around long enough, like you'll know that I really believe in self-reflective practice, like that, is really important that we're constantly checking with ourselves and we have our own kind of benchmarks that we're working towards. So like in reflection, I can look back and say, sometimes I was choosing social validity.
Oh, fully.
And oh, right? Like,
Yeah.
and how meaningful was that to the client or the caregiver?
Hmm.
When I was a new clinician and I hadn't figured out kind of my way to advocate for myself or my clients, sometimes other people who were not me or the client or the caregiver chose social validity. And I was like, yeah, sure. Right. I mean, that sounds great. And we just kind of and go forward. And I think that's why like I really like I said before, like partnership is so important about how to have those conversations. And as a supervisor, when I supervise others, it's important. I think it's important to integrate into our supervision how we are assessing like the social validity, right? And how are we assessing assent, which I think is such an important part of what we're doing for services.
It is. And it becomes more and more complex as kids get older and the schools start to have more of an opinion about what behaviors are expected at school. And then if we're working with insurance companies and they have their own opinions, so we are in a challenging position, challenging, but also fortunate because we get to, if we're skilled in it, bring everybody together rather than really try to um, pit pit them against each other. We can really work to build that collaborative relationship.
Yeah. And I think we keep kind of dancing and talking about it integrated in, but our second code word for CEUs is assent. So that's our second code word is assent. And I always kind of defer to Amy because I feel like you are do such a nice job explaining what it is. So I'm putting you on the spot.
It's okay. I don't mind. So assent is different from consent. Consent is the legal term, and assent is really the individual's agreement with not only the goals but also the interventions that are being used to achieve those goals. And assent can be verbal or nonverbal, and we can look at it from a lot of different perspectives. And when we're working with a child, maybe as young as a year and a half, you know, I I talk to parents a lot because in my early days, parents are like, well, but I can just pick him up and make him go. So why wouldn't I do that? And I said, well, yes. So you can do that because he's a year and a half old and you're bigger than he is. How's that strategy going to work when he's 18? Are you still then going to be able to force him into doing the things that you want him to do? It's really best at a very young age to start to work through how do I work as a team with this child? How can we partner to achieve the same goal? Because that's really what it's about. A lot of times the kids that we're working with, they want to be successful. Everybody wants to be successful, and what success looks like looks different for everyone. But my point is that a lot of times parents and kids want the same thing. They just want to go about it different ways. So they all want peace in their house. Kids, especially if you're looking at preteens and teenagers, they want their parents to just leave them alone, and parents, they want their kids to be more cooperative. And so we can come together at an agreement. If the kids want the parents to leave them alone, we find a way for them to do the things the parents need them to do independently. And all of a sudden, everybody's happy, So I think when we're looking at assent, we're looking at what do they all want their lives to look like? And that's a little bit trickier when the individual can't speak and you're looking at just their behaviors and you can tell, so I worked with this one child who um oh, I have so many stories. It's so hard for me to pick just one. This one I'm going to do real quickly because this falls into the category of whose assent is it or whose social validity is it? Because I was working with a 6-year-old. I went in and I'm sure I've told this story in previous episodes. So if you've heard it, you'll recognize him. But I went in and mom's like, I don't think ABA is going to work for him. This isn't, and over the last 6 months that he's been in services, the BCBA really for 6 months has focused on getting this kid to sit at a table. And he is a high energy kind of kid. He wants to run, climb, do all the things. And the BCBA's goal was to get him to sit at the table. For 6 months, they worked on that. And that's because she was providing telehealth. And it was for her convenience that he sit at the table. Well, this kid is not at all giving you his assent to that goal. And it shouldn't take 6 months for you to recognize that. He doesn't want to sit at the table. He wants to be up, moving around. And as soon as we eliminated sitting at the table as an expectation, he started picking up all sorts of skills. So it's really, really important to listen to not what they're saying, but what they're doing in response to those goals that you're putting into place. This also wasn't mom's goal. So it was truly just for the BCBA's convenience.
Yeah, it's, I think it's so hard to think about those kinds of situations, right? And I don't know how old this child was at the time.
He was 6.
Yeah. So from a developmental perspective too, right? Thinking about like I've gone in before and I've read plans or like, started services and, parents will be like, here's all my paperwork. And like you look at all the paperwork and I'm like, this child is 4. Like what 4-year-old is sitting at a table for just 20 minutes without any sort of, movement, behavior, whatever, right? Like I'm not 4 and I have a hard time sitting at a table for 20 minutes without doing stuff. So like, kind of thinking about and maybe that's not developmentally appropriate, for me as an adult, but whatever. But for young children, also thinking about those things, because when we miss it, when we miss the assent piece and whose social validity we're working toward, there can be a long-term impact on the mental health piece, right? And this is our intersection of ABA and mental health. So we are human. We are going to miss things. I could sit here and tell you so many times where I have missed something. And from a mental health perspective, I tell all my people I work with, we are going to make mistakes. The most important part is repair. So if I'm engaging in self-reflection and I'm noticing and I'm being, learning these skills and trying to gather information about assent, especially for young children or even any individual of any age who can't verbally communicate it to me, I can repair, I can shift, right? I can create interventions or engage in the natural environment in a way that works for the client that I'm supporting. Because when we miss it, we are contributing to the likelihood that, later down the road, we can see increased signs of anxiety and depression, right? Which may look more behavioral for some of the people that we're working with. We may see an increase in challenging behaviors, an increase in unsafe behaviors. And for some individuals, there is a significant link to masking, right? So that's where individuals kind of assess their environment and then shift or wear a mask to, fit in or look as, neurotypical in the environment that they can, which can lead to burnout, and anxiety in neurodivergent individuals. And I never want to say like, every single person, right? Because we're all different. We all respond to situations differently. But the information is in the research that the long-term effects of forcing some of these compliance-based interventions, not, looking at assent, is that we are increasing the likelihood of traumatic exposure. And over time, it can actually reduce self-advocacy skills, right? Because if somebody's trying to communicate in whichever way they communicate and it gets missed multiple times without repair, like think of a time, and I encourage everyone to think of this. We've probably all been in situations where we've told somebody we need something, or we've told somebody like something's going on, and that person is like, it's no big deal, you're fine. Or it's not important enough for me to shift, what you're asking me to shift. And we ask a few times and it doesn't change. What do? We stop asking, right? Maybe we just stop engaging with that person. We may leave the situation or the environment. Like all of these kind of consequences happen based off of our, wishes and goals not being met. And so it's the same for our clients. And one of the outcomes, unfortunately, is that people stop advocating for themselves if they are taught that when they communicate, they aren't listened to.
And it's such an important thing, those self-advocacy skills. And they're often not considered part of the curriculum, so when you're looking at ABA services, because they're not in our standard assessments, so you might be looking like at or using the VB map or the ABLES or even the Vineland, but none of those assess for self-advocacy skills, because some of them even consider that to be challenging behaviors because they're older assessments and they're not looking at non-compliance as potential self-advocacy. So
Yeah, looking at that as kind of an indicator or a cue, which is our third code word is cue.
okay. Nice.
Anyway, or looking at it as a cue or an indicator for withdrawing assent, right? Um, and again, I live in this place that if I have a client that I can ask, I'm going to ask in a way that's developmentally appropriate, right? So if I can say, you know, in a collaborative way, like what's the most perfect day look like for you? Or sometimes I'll ask, the people I work with, like if you could have anything go your way, what would that look like? Just kind of in curiosity. But if I can't do that, right? If I can't directly ask, then like what am I looking for that will indicate to me that a client is um withdrawing assent, which will lead me to having information about social validity for that specific client, right?
Yep.
And if it's different than the caregiver or the school, now I have a whole bunch of information to try and figure out, like you said earlier, Amy, like what the underlying kind of goal is, right? Is it to the client isn't suffering? Is it to have peace? Is it, to have more positive time together? Is it whatever it might be, right? But I can start to pull this picture together when I have all of that information.
Yeah, we'll have to make that the topic for another episode, because we have reached the end of this episode. We are going to be talking about trauma assumed care in the next episode. So make sure you check that one out. But I have enjoyed this topic. We could talk about it for days.
For days and days. And so if I were going to like give anyone a call to action, right? I just love that word action. We see it in so many places. How are you evaluating your own practice, right? And how are you assessing assent from all of the people you're providing services to so that you can have an understanding of where everybody's social validity is and then how do you navigate? So like it's kind of these skill-based things. So my call to action is are your treatment goals truly meaningful to your client specifically? Can we isolate that before we start to look at the goals for
And
everybody
how
else?
are you going to measure that over time? So that's super exciting.
So thanks for joining us. today on Action Insights. And we look forward to seeing you on our next podcast.
Thank you.